Hi there, and welcome to the Sports 2000 podcast. This series takes you behind the scenes of this British sports car prototype series that includes Durotechs and Pintos. I'm Sue Stockdale, and I talk to some of the people involved in the Sports 2000 community, giving you an insight into why Sports 2000 is sometimes called motorsport's best kept secret. In this episode, we go down under to Australia, and I'm talking to Rob Whitwell to discover what it's like to race a Sports 2000 there. Welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Thank you very much indeed, and hello from Australia. Am I the token colonial that's making a contribution?
Well, we have had somebody who is Australian who's in the UK, Grant Gibson, who races now in Sports 2000 in the UK. But to speak to somebody in Australia, you are the first. And you're probably going to make me envious about your lovely weather.
Exactly.
So, Rob, I'm wondering, here we are speaking about Sports 2000. How did you get into it in the first place?
Well, I'm just turning 71. I've been racing now for 22 odd years, stopped paying school fees and turned 50 odd and just decided it was time. And I'd had MGs and things. I had an MG for a long time. Very powerful car. And to tell the truth, it just got a bit beyond me, the amount of work and effort and the cost involved in running that car every year. So I got sick of it, but wanted to keep going. I felt that I'd always wanted to have a Can-Am car, but they were out of my budget. So I've been looking at going to the historic race meetings in Australia, and we used to run our cars, the MGs, with them at times. And I'd always seen sports cars and thought they looked fantastic. Spoke to a mate there that actually had one, and he said the cost of running was fantastically economical, relatively. And that's what I thought about. I thought I'd get into it. And eventually I bought a car in America and bought it out. So eventually sold the MG. And now I think my MG budget that I would spend in a year, I still haven't spent that much in 5 years running the Sports 2000.
So it's sounding like you're certainly saving yourself some money, if nothing else. In what category does the Sports 2000 run then? You said you've seen it at some historic meetings.
Yeah.
I know in the UK there's Durotechs and there's Sports 2000s together, and the historic and the Pinto cars. What happens in Australia?
We have sort of two levels of motorsport, that everyday motorsport. It's not the V8 supercars or the things like your touring car competition there. But we have a state championship level, which runs everything from Formula Fords through to sports sedans to sports cars with the Lamborghinis and Ferraris and everything like that. And that's what I used to run the MG in the MG categories and things through there. But there is no sports cars like the S2000s in that. So the other part of this is that in Australia we have purely historic meetings. And those historic meetings run right around Australia, but mainly on the East Coast, so Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And in those races there are, in our category of controls, there's a thing called Group R Historic, and that is for sports cars. So they're sports cars that are in the 60s, 70s, 80s, sports cars set up. And the Sports 2000s all run in that category, Group Historic. But also within that, there's a subcategory again of Sports 2000s. And those Sports 2000s are all these Sports 2000s that ran and had a race history from before December 1984.
So if I was coming along to one of the circuits to watch one of those races, typically how many Sports 2000 cars would I see in a race?
Well, I just happened to pull a sheet out and check that for you earlier today. Phillip Island Grand Prix circuit, which is in Victoria, we have a classic festival historic meeting down there in usually March each year. And in March 2019, in the Group R Q&R sports cars, there were 28 cars on the grid and 14 of those cars were Sports 2000s. So quite a lot. And those Sports 2000s were all 1984 and prior, except for my car that's a 1985. So they're all that. But amongst those cars then, There were also a couple of Porsches, 956, 962s, Le Mans cars, a couple of McLaren M1Bs, M6Bs, and also a number of other big sports cars, V8 5-litre or 6-litre sports cars, Alphans and things like that. So quite a broad cross-section of cars from, as I say, Can-Am cars through to these really, there are also a couple of clubmen. But in that instance, 28 cars, 14 of which were actually Sports 2000s. And over the last year, just as COVID was starting, there was still 10 or 11 Sports 2000s in a group of 18. So quite strong groups.
You touch on there the race, or at least the planned race pre-COVID. And I understand you were sitting on the grid when the Grand Prix weekend race was cancelled there.
Friday the 13th. So we have the Australian Grand Prix usually as the opening round of the Formula One Championship. And as one of the races or events on the calendar for that weekend, there's what they call an historic demonstration. So it ends up being a number of sports cars and cars with some historic value in them. So I had a run. So I was really looking forward to it. We had one run on the Thursday, but on the Friday morning, we'd heard a couple of whispers as we were going into the track, but they said everything's going to be fine. We were the first category out for the day to go out and do that. So we're in the cars, warmed up, moved down to dummy grid, and they said, just hang on a minute. It'll be a couple of minutes. We'll just get you out shortly. Just hold on. 2.5 hours later, sitting on dummy grid, the whole thing, they came out and went stroke across the neck, said, turn around and go home. The whole Grand Prix has been cancelled. So it was fairly disappointing.
So that was a memorable Friday the 13th.
It was.
For the wrong reasons.
For the wrong reasons.
One of the things I did want to ask you about, Rob, in relation to those races that you mentioned a moment ago, where there's a good proportion of cars, how long are the races? How many minutes?
Well, what we have is these race meetings tend to be 3-day meetings. So a Friday, or in the case of Phillip Island, it's a Thursday, which is practice and setup. Then Friday is qualifying, practice and race in the afternoon. Then Saturday and Sunday are races in the morning, races in the afternoon. So you're having a fairly long period of time and races. And the Phillip Islands are a track of about, I think, 3 miles or something, 3 and a bit miles. And you end up from, say, 4 or 5 laps up to 8 or 9 laps. So there'll be different length races over the weekend. So you're generally out there like for 30 minutes or so at a time.
It gives you a good amount of time to get a lot of seat time each race.
Plenty of seat time. And over the weekend, at the end of the weekend, I've had it, I'm buggered. So I'm ready to go home. So, and then it's a 2.5 or 4 hour drive home from the various tracks. So it's a long way. But yeah, you get good value. It's pretty economical, I think, relative to what happens in the UK. Like that 4-day meeting at Phillip Island will be about, say, $700 for your entry and your garage space and everything else on the whole lot for 4 days, and down to perhaps, $500 for one of the 3-day meetings.
So it's good to get a perspective about how it works in Australia. What happens then if you have a shunt or something happens to your car and you need to get some spare parts? How easy is it to come by them in Australia?
Well, that's always an issue because the variety of cars and the depth of field and the things is pretty limited, really. And I think that's how I came to be introduced to you and what's going on through Clive Steeper, because I was chasing Clive about some information and some parts and things like that for my car. So Google is an amazing resource, and the shipping costs are the killers, but generally you can get the bits relatively easy, and there's always somebody in Australia who's an expert, I can promise you, about Ford Pinto engine or a Tiga or a Lull or a March, because that's about all. We have a few Royales, but generally there's a lot of Tigers. Tigers, I'm not sure how it's referred to there, but that's about it.
I can clarify that it is Tiga. Having a guest in our upcoming episode will be Howden Ganley, who's the manufacturer of them. I have spoken to him in that conversation and have it from him directly.
Tim Schenken, who was Howden's partner in setting up and running the type manufacturing operation. He's been race director in Australia for the V8 supercars competition all the time. And he just announced his retirement out of that role of race director for all those.
I guess I'm wondering about part of your motivation or interest to race. I know you've told us about now you don't have school fees and other costs that are restricting you being able to afford it, but what is it you get from racing? What do you enjoy about it?
I'm a very competitive animal, actually. And been in business all my life. And from starting off from a kid, I had a go-kart originally. Then my first car was an Austin Healey Sprite, and we built a Formula Junior sort of knockoff with a mate out the road with HRD Vincent, twin motorbike engine in it. So always have been in car. And I grew up on a service station and a garage. So love speed, motorbikes, things like that when I was young. And I've always had a sports car, but just was unable to enjoy it enough. And I'd always wanted to race properly and have a bit of a go at it. As I said, when a few of those other things stopped, I got into racing because I like to do the work myself on the cars. I like to do all the maintenance and the setup and the control and understand. I'm a civil engineer by profession, and that engineering background comes out in wanting to control how the car is presented on the track and what it goes that way. But it's a bit funny, really, because I didn't tell anybody about this. And one day I was doing something downstairs in the garage, and my wife came out to me and said, "Have you got something to tell me?" And I said, "I don't know, have I?" She said, "I think you've got something to tell me." And she said, "I've been upstairs looking in one of the bedrooms," and she happened to find the new race kit and helmet and all those things. So she said, "Look, I'm okay. I'm really happy. You've always wanted to do it, to go ahead and do it." And I said, "Oh, but there's something else I've got to tell you as well now. There's a car that goes with all that as well that's coming in a couple of weeks." So it was quite funny at this stage because we got out. But anyway, it went really well. And Diane supports me and encourages me greatly as I get a lot of enjoyment out of it. But she's not somebody who wants to come to the track with me and watch it and do it. She gets a bit anxious about all that. Her major excursion with me at the track was to go to race at Spa-Francorchamps. So we went from Australia and raced there, and she spent most of her time down at Villeroy and Bock in Luxembourg. So that was that. But we had a fantastic. We built two MGB historic cars, FIA compliant cars, shipped them to Belgium, and raced in the Spa 6-hour race, and did I think 4 other races as well with bits and pieces. So we had a group of 6 of us that put in and made it all happen, and we had about 25 people that went along. It was just the most fantastic holiday and fun, and it was just great. So we really enjoyed ourselves. And I still do, even though we really haven't been racing with COVID because it's been so restricted. It's been a chance to do maintenance and change things on the car and reset things up. And I really enjoy it to go back and do it. And I think at 71 years of age, it's still, in Sports 2000, really comfortable and easy to drive and do it. You don't have to go flat out all the time and drive like it's, you're rubbing is racing. That's not the way it's approached in our category, but it's a lot of fun.
I can hear that energy in your voice in terms of the satisfaction perhaps it gives you from having that competitive space to enjoy your driving. And in terms of the future, how Sports 2000 might expand or grow in Australia, what's your view on, is that something that is a possibility?
I do have a view on it. Well, as I'm aware, there's, as I say, probably 14 or 15 odd cars that are regularly on the track. I think there's another 8 or 9 that can be very competitive too, but are not running all the time. So perhaps in the early to mid-20s of numbers of vehicles that are available. And as I said, they're all the ones that are only before the end of 1984. And I know there are other cars out there that are beyond that stage, which fit into the second category you have, where you have the historic, I think, and then the vintage part, or the Pinto, and then the Duratec part. So I'd really like to think that in Australia we could see that second category coming to play and just having the 2 classes there. I'd like to think that we could expand it more and perhaps even get our own specific races in within the historic championship, or even perhaps get some races that would be done in the state championship level, which is within each of the states, and we could run it that way and perhaps extend the season for us, because they are economical to run. But I think if we could achieve some of this, it would make a far stronger marketplace for the cars, because you need to keep them churning over. You need new people to come in and take them on, as there's a lot of blokes my age out there racing. And as they decide that it's perhaps beyond them to keep at that point, you want to be able to have them handed on to somebody who can enjoy it. And I think if it's seen that there is a marketplace, because there is lots of competition and lots of activity and available racing, it'll make a difference to the market. So I've got a bit of a target over the next year or so to see if we can get that to happen in Australia.
So there being a buoyant community of interest creates that sense of marketplace and interest in those cars in that category.
Absolutely, yeah. And like, everybody sees them and thinks they look fantastic, and you tell them how economical they are to run and they can't believe it compared to what they're running. And I think also because they do have the extra body around it, a lot of people are more nervous about the Formula Fords and the Formula Vs, which are very competitive in that there. But with the body surrounding it all, you haven't got the problem of locking wheels so much, and they're very competitive cars. Because of the controlled formula, you see this exciting racing, and it's great. As I say, a lot of people at the race meetings, and I'm sure it's the same over there, it's the same the world over, the spectators and the guys that are in the paddock all want to go around and look at each other's cars. But you get genuine encouragement and passion about what's happening with the 2000s, I think so.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that the same happens in the UK with people going around the paddock looking at all the cars, and they are very impressive to see the Sports 2000 grid on a nice sunny day with the cars all polished and ready to go. We've been speaking predominantly about Sports 2000 cars, Rob. I'm wondering if you had an opportunity to drive any other car, what would be your dream car to drive?
Well, as I said, I always wanted a Can-Am car originally to do that, and I've got a mate who's got one, but I can beat him all the time in the Sports 2000, so I'm not too worried about trying to drive that anymore. And he's just decided he's just taken that car off slicks and put it back onto treaded old Dunlop historic rubber, and he says it's a different car altogether to drive now, so he's enjoying it that way. So I've driven a number of different cars anyway, Porsches and things like that, but they've never really interested me that much. My MGB, it was a GT V8. It was a bit over 500 horsepower that was going through there. It was, I had a 6-speed sequential boxing it out of one of the V8 supercars that was here. It was unbelievably quick. Like, you're doing 300 or so down on the main straights at the Phillip Island. But they're just not quick through corners and things like that. And that's where the Sports 2000 is so nimble. And it does virtually the same times as that car. So I don't know, really. I'd still like to have a drive of a Formula One car. At the end of the day, I'd obviously have no hope of probably even driving an older one, and certainly wouldn't be able to drive a modern one, but it'd be nice to drive an F1 car at one point.
That would be amazing, I imagine. Is there a circuit that you haven't driven on in other parts of the world or even in Australia that you would love to drive on?
Well, as I indicated, we went to Spa. I love Spa as a circuit. I just thought that was an incredible race circuit. It was so smooth and so flowing compared to a lot of our circuits. I've raced it at Bathurst, and that's also an incredible circuit. Having crashed out there, I know what it feels like as well to wipe your car out there. So really exciting circuit. But I suppose as much as anything, I think Laguna Seca, Corkscrew and things, they'd be fantastic, and Silverstone. They'd be the ones you'd like to go. They've got so much history about them, and they'd just be fantastic to run on. So I might have to bring the Sports 2000 over and have a run over there at some point.
A future project for you, an aspiration to get your car on the grid on a Sports 2000 race here at Silverstone in the UK. Rob, it's been really fantastic to get a sense from you about what Sports 2000 is like in Australia, and to find out about your passion and interest in cars and being competitive. I wish you well in upcoming races in the season you've got ahead. And it's been lovely to speak to you today.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, I've got one last thing I would like to say if I can. John Dean Bowers was extremely helpful to me because I imported my car from America as effectively, not as a wreck, but it was just run into the ground and it was terrible. No SC85s here at all, finding information about them was very difficult, but John had one, and I came over to England on one trip and spent a couple of days, I think, with John and going through everything, and he was extraordinarily helpful. And that's where I found your group within the S2000 family there have been wonderfully helpful in that. And I'm pretty sure there's probably lots of other guys in Australia that have had help from them as well. So to help you today has been my pleasure and participate. And hopefully we can catch up again, and I'll pass this around to everybody in due course.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you very much. And of course, you'll have other episodes of this series to find out more about the Sports 2000 community in the UK here and some of the drivers that participate within that as well. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Rob Whitwell and learning more about what happens in Sports 2000 in Australia. And if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please help us to spread the word by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you use to listen to us, and tell your friends about the podcast too. Remember, you can connect with Sports 2000 on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter, and we'll put links to the website in the show notes. In the next episode, I'll be talking to Howden Ganley, who along with Tim Schenken were the manufacturers of the Tiga cars that race in the Pinto category. I do hope you can join me then.